Welcome back to another Continuing Conversations. I'm Michael Dismuke, one of the co-hosts here on Continuing Conversations, which is all about Star Trek Adventures and Captain's Log. I'm a freelance writer for Star Trek Adventures and lead writer on Captain's Log, and this show is not a show unless we have with us Jim Johnson.
Hey everybody, Jim Johnson. I am the project manager and line editor for the Star Trek Adventures RPG and the Captain's Log solo RPG, both published by Modiphius Entertainment, and also co-host on this here show with Michael. Lo, these many years, 2 years going strong, 220, 130 odd episodes, moving on toward 200. We've got second edition out now. We've got lots and lots of stuff to talk about. And I am super excited to have two special guests on our show tonight to talk all about traits in second edition and how we have put a new emphasis on traits, especially Nathan and his development team. So with that in mind, I will have Nathan introduce himself.
Hi, hailing frequencies open. I'm Nathan Dowdell. I'm the senior RPG developer at Modiphius and the custodian of the 2D20 system in all its incarnations. And obviously lead designer on Star Trek Adventures, both first and second editions.
Absolutely. Thank you for being here. Really appreciate you and your time as always. And then our other special guest is none other than the writer of Sentience 2D20 and some other 2D20 games and other games coming out soon that I won't spill. I'll let him do that on his own. But Al Spader, introduce yourself, please.
How's it going? Al Spader. I'm a freelance writer. I was the lead writer on the Federation Klingon War Tactical Campaign. And yeah, I did a World Builders game called Sentience and working on a few things behind the scenes as well. So excited to talk about traits. They're like my favorite thing about this system.
Yeah, I'm going to brag a little bit about Sentience too, because I got to he ran a game and we got to play it for the first time last night, and oh my god, I'm addicted. And it would actually fit into the Star Trek universe if you ever wanted to integrate it. I was thinking about that, but anyways, that'll be another show about how to integrate Sentience with STA. Today, again, as stated, we're talking about traits, which I have to admit are my favorite mechanic in Star Trek Adventures role playing. And so who better to define what a trait is and how they're supposed to be used but Nathan Dowdell. Why don't you launch us into this subject and then we'll get into the nitty gritty.
So a trait is fundamentally an opportunity to take elements of the ongoing fiction of a game and give it some mechanical weight. A trait is a short word, a short phrase, or even a single word that describes something that is both important and true to the current situation. It might be applied to a character. It might be a piece of equipment. It might be just circumstances or weather conditions or any number of other factors that could affect the way that the game is currently happening. And traits all work in fundamentally the same way. Well, regardless of what the name is, if the trait or the trait's name is, if the trait is relevant to a particular action that's being carried out, then the action either gets easier or harder, or it makes something possible that was impossible before, or makes something impossible that was possible before. Those are the broadest elements of it, and they kind of shape the landscape of the game by pointing out all the things that are these are important, these are significant, and thus here's the way that they can affect gameplay in a fairly consistent, fairly straightforward, and easy to apply manner.
Good. Al, what's your take on traits?
Well, I think that, traits have always been an important part of the game since I've started playing. And I think that some people, it might take a little while before they understand how to use traits appropriately in their game. But we've been really trying over the last, 2 years of books to push traits more to the forefront and to empower game masters and players to use them. I'm thinking like even in the Lower Decks guide, we started putting traits on planets and things like that. So literally anything in your game can have this little descriptor that says something that is, true about that object. And like Nathan said, it can be good, it can be bad. It can be a negative trait today, a positive trait tomorrow, and I think it's really adds a lot of flavor to the game.
Good, Jim. Your take on traits?
Yeah, I think I like Al. I think traits are one of my most favorite parts of the game because there's so much you can do. They're so flexible, right? And it's just this little truth that you can add to a character or a ship or a location that encompasses the totality of that thing in one word or one phrase. And Nathan, I don't remember if I told you this, but way back in 17 or 18, one of those two years, I went to Gen Con. I had an opportunity to meet Francisco Nepatello, who is the lead writer on the One Ring RPG and a bunch of other stuff. And he and I were just talking about the One Ring and just like where he was going with it and what was happening with it. And in our little conversation, he mentioned how much he loved the trait concept from 2D20, because like if you have a Vulcan, right? A Vulcan has a trait, Vulcan, and like everything that is important about a Vulcan or is true about a Vulcan is encompassed in that one word, right? It's so easy because like you don't have to go on with paragraphs and paragraphs and paragraphs about what a Vulcan is. You can just say this character is a Vulcan. And so like if the players and the game masters understand to some degree what a Vulcan is in the setting, then that one little word added on their character sheet encompasses the totality of everything. And he just loved that economy of game design. And I think he had mentioned he was trying to figure out ways to, I think he was working on second edition of One Ring at the time, and he was trying to think of ways to streamline certain pieces of it. And he just remarked on how much he liked that mechanic. So if I didn't tell you 5 years ago, I guess I'll tell you now that he really liked it. But go ahead, Michael.
I don't think I'd heard that story, but I'm thankful for the praise, even if I can't take full credit for the mechanic. They were originally developed in first edition. 2D20 didn't have them before Star Trek Adventures, and I developed them during first edition as a way of handling the wide variety of bizarre and often single episode and then they're gone pieces of equipment that would turn up during any given episode of Star Trek. You never see them again, and you often don't really have a specific purpose for them beyond just them enabling a character to do something that they couldn't already do. And to that end, I borrowed an element from the way aspects work in Fate. For those familiar with that system, to function as traits. It's just the difficulty and narrative permissions elements of it, without the currency being tied to it, because we already had reasonably complex systems of meta currency built into 2D20. I didn't want to add to that further. So that element became. That element was embedded into into first edition through equipment, and then expanded out into something more than that. But because it was so new, we hadn't really gotten a handle on the full scope of what we could do with it, as within the game, but also within the overall game line and within the game mechanic going forward. So it's not used or explained quite as clearly in first edition as it could have been, and it's something that we wanted to really bring forward in second edition.
I'm glad you said that, because I want to break it down to that point now. Jim, playing off your Vulcan, you were talking about Vulcan traits. We're going to talk about character traits, we're going to talk about ship traits, and then we're going to talk about where everything else now, in my opinion, is lumped in. You can correct me if I'm wrong, which is scene traits, and including it could be equipment or conditions and stuff like that. But going back, just so all of you can kind of see what we're talking about, on our ship we have we have a Tellarite, and he's a tubby Tellarite. And so when he decided to make a move and try to capture and jump onto a hover sled in one of our last games, something that would have been difficulty 2, trying to jump onto a passing hover sled, I said, you know what, but you're a Tellarite. And so this is difficulty 3 for you. Whereas if, say, for instance, he was a Gorn, which is super agile, I would have dropped it to a difficulty 1 because of that trait that is inherent to the character. So when we're talking about traits, people, that's the kind of mechanic we're talking about. And characters and ships and scene traits can can affect that difficulty up and down, and like Nathan said, make the possible impossible or the impossible possible, right? So let's start going from that aspect. And there's one other difference. Nathan, correct me if I'm wrong. It wasn't really said in first edition, but I used to play it like this way, and now it is very clear in 2E that you could have a scene trait with a intensity. So in first edition, I would say, you know what, this door is steel 3. Like, it's Dura Steel 3. And that way they knew that something that would have normally been easy with a phaser blasting through a wall, difficulty 1, this is now a difficulty 4 action. So is that true? Was it kind of in 1E, but now it's really like hard stamped into 2E?
It was, yeah. I'm pretty sure there was a paragraph or so about it in first edition, but it was just kind of an out of the way, almost, well, not really an afterthought, but not. It wasn't front and center. It wasn't emphasized. And during development here, I wanted to pick it out, make sure that it was that bit clearer and that bit more obvious how it worked. In part because at that time, we were still working on different versions of how ship combat worked, and the possibility of of distinguishing between different types of damage, different types of breaches on a ship using these traits of different potencies, different intensities. Okay, yeah, you've taken damage to the ship. That's one breach, that's one trait. Here's a whole breach that tears across 3 decks. That's probably a bigger trait. That's like a potency of 2, maybe potency 3. That's a much bigger form of damage, and having that thought of, okay, sometimes you might have damage to the ship or circumstances that are lots of little traits. Sometimes you might have this whole one big problem to deal with, and mechanically, how should those be different and how should those be similar? And it kind of, the end result of the ship combat didn't work out quite that way, but the idea of having those potency for traits was still a valuable one, I felt.
Okay, let's state that here, because this is something that I want people to understand too. Suppose you end up with Hull Breach 3, right? Deck 7, Hull Breach 3, because it affects 3 decks. Can players use the create advantage, create trait to, at a difficulty 2, to bring that down to Hull Breach 2? Like, yes. Can we talk about that? Because I don't think people play enough on that. And I think I want to be really clear on how you can mess with these traits.
You absolutely could do that. Yes. If you've got a trait, if there is a situation or is a problem represented in your scene by a trait that's got 2, 3 or more potency, then you can try and remove individual stacks of potency as if they were individual traits, because essentially that's what it is. It's multiple identical traits stacked on top of each other to represent a bigger problem. So you can increment it up and down by performing tasks, spending momentum.
Thank you.
I believe that the actual damage control rules and the ship repair rules do account for having breaches to a ship that are of higher potency and how they affect difficulty and how they affect your momentum spends and things like that as well.
Very clear. And I want to reverse this on the player's advantage too. Say you're trying to barricade a door from Gorn getting in. Players can barricade level 1, barricade level 2, barricade level 3 as scene traits to make it harder for those Gorn to break in. So I just want everyone to understand.
Could, yeah.
Okay. Good.
As long as it makes sense in the scene, of course. But yeah, they absolutely could. This is a way to double down on the things you're already doing. And potentially, because you can create a trait by a skill test or by a task roll and by spending momentum, you could do both at once. You attempt that difficulty 2 task to create a trait. And then if you've got 2 momentum on top of that, you spend that to reinforce it further.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. See, and that goes back to our conversation in the other episode where we were talking about how it's important for players to try to do things, right? That's how you generate that momentum, is attempt things, try things out, make something happen in the scene, and don't just stand there and wait for something to happen, or don't just sit there debating amongst your players about, oh, what should we do, right? Just take some action and start making tasks and earning some momentum, and then apply that momentum to the scene, either by creating traits or changing traits, or doing other stuff that you can do with momentum.
I love it. I mean, let's go. We talked a little bit. We saw an example of a character trait. Ship traits are interesting to me. I've never really leaned into ship traits too much because we tend to. We don't play a big pew pew ship games a lot in our campaign. So, can we talk a little bit about ship traits? What might those look like?
So, from my perspective, I'd say that by and large, a ship trait is almost a location trait because you treat the ship as a location. If it doesn't necessarily have to apply in ship combat, but if you've boarded another ship, the fact that it's of a different type than the type that you're used to, the player character's ship is probably going to have the Federation Starship trait. In second edition, it's also going to have a trait that is of its class and space frame. It might have a couple of others on top of that may represent other things. But they'll all have that Federation Starship trait. So it's assumed that the environment levels, the structure, the configuration, the computer systems, and all of the technology on board fits within what you would expect of a Federation ship and its environment.
So are you saying in the case of, say, if it's an Intrepid class and that's the trait, then maybe we don't have to spin for the EMH talent because that's already inherent to it?
I'm not necessarily saying that. That can certainly be ruled, and that's something, to an extent, that's something covered in the text elsewhere. But I'm saying more that that's kind of like the baseline of what you'd expect a Starfleet engineer to know. But if you're then beaming onto another ship, say you've beamed onto a Borg cube to investigate it, well, that ship has Borg Starship as its trait. It's not that familiar. It's configured differently. Its technology is different. That can easily be an opportunity for the GM to go, this test is more difficult than it would normally be. This test is impossible because it's not configured that way. You've got to find a way around this particular problem. It's an opportunity for the GM to create problems and create difficulties. But at the same time, if you've done that, but you've got a liberated Borg science officer with you, they may well have enough familiarity with it to work around those problems. Or the other example would be the episode of DS9 where they go on to Empok Nor. It's a Cardassian space station, so it's built by the Cardassians. It's got Cardassian technology. It's got all of those factors to it. So they brought along Garak because he knows Cardassian security systems better than a Federation crew. It creates those interactions and those conflicts, and that's the kind of instance where I'd use ship traits. Certainly.
Yeah, he knows Cardassian systems like Impact 3 or Intensity 3. This guy.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about traits because this is what you do when you're playing when you're in charge of a game, right? You constantly watch the show and you're like, oh, that's a threat spend. Oh, that's a momentum spend. Oh, there's a trait. It just happens when you watch the episode, right? And I can't turn it off. Nathan, I don't know if you have the same experience too when you're watching an episode. You're constantly thinking about the game.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I've been rewatching Strange New Worlds recently, just in the background, and I've been doing it. It's been coming up again.
Yeah, and that's what made me think about this comment, Michael, where scene trait Federation Starship. That means that like everything that we've ever seen about a Federation Starship on this show is true for that ship. Like that the corridors are usually well lit, warm, inviting. At least in the 80s and 90s, they had carpet on the floor as opposed to decks like they had in the Constitution 3. But the thing that really struck me is I watched the season 2 finale again, and when Chapel is on the Cayuga, she is rummaging around in the storage compartments. in the corridor there, right? And she finds the EV suit, right? And it's like, oh yeah, well that's because it's a Federation starship. She knows to look for it because of course it's going to be there. So the Enterprise has storage compartments on the sides of the corridors that has flashlights and phasers and emergency supplies, whatever. And she knew just instinctively that because I'm on another Federation starship of a different class, that stuff is probably going to be here in the corridors because it's a standard common component of the starships. And you could do that with anything with the Klingon starship is going to be kind of like dark and smoky and mysterious and green because that's what we've seen on the show. And Romulan starships are more austere and stark. And so it's just it's such a great way to quickly help players establish the scene, right? Because like if you just tell them, okay, you're in a Federation corridor versus a Klingon corridor, hopefully that'll immediately help set their brains without you as the game master necessarily going on for 30 seconds to a minute describing the scene. Of course, you want to describe the scene, but it's also a nice little shortcut just to put in here's the 3 scene traits that are here. Boom, 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 and now we can get on with the story.
Yeah, and as I'm starting to think of starships in the game and whatnot, Nathan, a couple of questions. First, would you consider a mission profile also a trait about a ship? Like it's not listed in the trait section, obviously. And
arguably, you could, yeah.
Yeah. And a follow-up to that, I believe in one of your blogs you mentioned there's a new way to get traits on your starship in 2nd edition. Is that correct?
Yeah, there are a couple of ways. So a new element to ship creation is now the service record, which is an encapsulation of how the ship has spent its service prior to the game, whether it's a prototype fresh out of space dock like the Defiant was, or if it's spent decades in service like Kirk's Enterprise, which had been flying around for 20 years before he became the captain. Different. Then they all provide both an additional trait for the ship as well as an extra special rule that tweaks the way the ship works in some small but interesting way. And those extra traits can be potentially quite interesting. There is one in there which is. Represents that the ship has survived a particular notable battle or war, which would then become a trait as with the name of that battle or war noted in it. And you could use that to represent things like the readiness of the crew, potentially for combat situations, but also in broader terms, its reputation amongst other species. Maybe maybe this ship that fought in the Dominion War, that fought in the Second Battle of Chentoka. Because you're on board this ship, Klingons and Romulans might be better disposed towards you because they fought alongside you during that conflict. The ship's got a few old battle scars, but it's also got a legacy and a reputation all of its own. And there's ways to do that. There's also, as part of the reputation system, which obviously we developed for the Klingon core book, you can buy traits for your characters that way as they gain reputations and things like that. I'm pretty sure it's actually listed in the text that you can use that to add that to the ship as a whole as well, especially if you're the commanding officer, because you are captain whatever of the USS generic example.
You mentioned something there that I wanted to just highlight, Nathan, that was really, really cool. And I know that Michael and I were mentioning earlier how we can use traits to adjust the difficulty of different tasks and whatnot. But Nathan also just said that they can also just be purely narrative, right? If the Klingons and the Romulans respect you because you're on this ship, like that, there doesn't have to be any challenge to that or difficulties or anything. It could just be played out through role playing, and you can do this with individual characters that respect one another, and so on and so forth as well.
Well, I like that because like diplomacy, like say for instance, if you're on the Kirk's Enterprise and you're about to meet up with some Klingons, diplomacy, they're going to be a little bit more diplomatic with you because you are Kirk's Enterprise. You are known for taking out Klingons, and so that kind of trait can be played in there.
Yeah, I love that. Go ahead, Nathan.
It's one of those elements where it's a kind of almost a soft power version of narrative permissions. Because of X, I can attempt this thing that I couldn't normally do. They are willing to listen to me. They are willing to not open fire at the first sight of me because I might have something important to say, and my reputation helps me in that regard.
Only Nixon could go to China.
Exactly, as that old Vulcan saying. And that's a lot of where traits stand, because beyond that that core element of it boils down to it makes things easy, it makes things possible, it makes things harder, it makes things impossible. That's like the very basics of it. But once you've gotten to grips with traits, and I covered this briefly in the GM book, the GM guidebook. Fundamentally, a trait is just a tag for the GM to say, this thing might require you to rule differently. This thing should be a prompt to do things a little bit differently. So once you're adept at running the game, once you've gotten a bit more experience and a bit more confidence running the game, you can use traits to prompt pretty much any alternate ruling. If the enemy has a trait that represents a particular vulnerability that you've found, you could give extra damage to attacks with it, or allow an option. We found a vulnerability in their shields, we can beam through. We can do this thing now that we couldn't do, or we can apply this extra mechanic in a way that we couldn't. You can do basically anything you want with it. It's just, and all the trait is a reminder that this is an important thing. This is a thing that we've drawn attention to. The camera has paused on it for a moment, or the characters have discussed it in dialogue. This thing is relevant to the situation, so let's rule on it a little bit differently and pay a little bit more attention to it.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic tool for the game masters to help their players, especially when players may be having an off night and may not be catching your cues. Like, you're trying to prod them in a certain direction a little bit just to kind of keep things moving, and they're not getting it, whatever. If you just have those traits handy, like, maybe, I don't know if you have like a whiteboard that you're listing them, or if you're playing online, you've got a little text window open showing the traits or whatever. This is just to say, here's the 5 things that are traits in this scene. They're written down for a reason, right? Like, these are things you can focus on if you don't have any other ideas on what to do in this scene. Kind of take a peek at the trait list, just as a way to help players think about, okay, I'm in this scene. What can I do? What can I attempt? What can I try to manipulate? And I ask questions about what kind of things are in the scene that I could maybe spend some momentum on to obtain information about if I succeeded that task, right? Just to help them get into it.
My standard for that is when I GM in person, I GM with a pack of dry wipe index cards and a set of whiteboard markers, because I can reuse them, I can edit them. No, it's not as messy as using post-it notes and things like that. So I've got a stack of those in my GMing kit. And even during demo games where I've not bothered to explain the full traits mechanic to the players, I just want to get them playing and have a fun scenario within the course of an hour. I will still use the trait mechanics, and if they do a good thing or they come up with an idea that I think should have a benefit, I will write it down on an index card and hand it to that player and say, mention this to me when you think it comes up. And if they come up with if they suffer a complication, or if they fail a task roll, and I think there should be a bit of a setback, I'll write that down. I'll probably write that down in red pen rather than blue for to show that it's a bad thing. And I'll hand it out to them again. And these become, even if the players don't know the mechanics behind the idea of traits, the fact that they're out on cards in front of them becomes this visceral little reminder of the way that they are shaping the game world around them.
Thank you.
And it's so really, glad you said really that. Useful.
I ran a game at a con a couple of weeks ago, and that's exactly. I put index cards out, big black markers, so that it was in their face every time they looked in my direction. And to your point, if they said something like, I'm going to do this, and hopefully they were doing something with some chemicals trying to spray somebody, they said, I hope this doesn't blow up in my face, just to have them understand the importance of it. I spent 2 threat to have it blow up in their face, and it blocked their face mask. And I put that, you're now blinded. And so I was trying to help them understand that you say something negative that might happen. I, as GM, can spin threat and make that a trait for you. So I think that's important to have them front and center online. What we do, and I still don't think, Al, in our game, people look at it enough. We have our own channel in Discord called Traits, and we keep them tracked there. And, you know, maybe it's broken up so people know only people in this scene are affected by this particular trait if they split the party. But again, you got GMs, you've got to drive your people to look at those traits and be super creative in incorporating them into the story, creating them, eliminating them, using them for the benefit of the narrative.
Mm-hmm. I have a question for you, Nathan, and you know, also Michael and Al, because you certainly got plenty of experience playing this game and other games. I know there's always a risk of like adding too much stuff to the table in terms of like tokens and cards and tchotchkes and other things just to help the gameplay. But I'm wondering, because traits are so flexible and because there's so many components of the game that are traits, like even to where you could have stressed be a trait, or injuries could be traits too. And would you ever want to have like a token that says injured or stressed, or like the really super common stuff that we know are traits that come up from time to time, to drop that on a player or drop on the table? Or would you rather it be just more, you know, narrative and not have to rely on all the bits, right, to add to a game?
I mean, injuries in second edition are traits. It's not just you could treat them as they specifically are. Same with breaches now. That was a part of the streamlining moving to second edition. But I do agree it can. There is the potential for overloading the table with notes in this way. But I would say that the better solution rather than just have like generic tokens of you are injured. You still want the name of the trait still provides flavor to whatever is injured. So it's not just that a character is injured; they've been stabbed with a Klingon Duktag dagger, and that's their injury. And that will affect them in different ways than if they'd taken plasma burns from a grazing hit from a disruptor. Those would affect them differently, should probably require different first aid. There's the place where the narrative and the mechanics interact. But I would say that it's probably more useful just to try and have traits kind of cycle in and out regularly. So the moment something is no longer relevant, wipe that card clear, or throw away that note, put it off to one side. Traits that characters create, especially things like plans and strategies and improvised tools and stuff like that, may only have finite uses, and you get rid of them when they're done. It's they stick around. They should only stick around for as long as they need to, and if the table's piling up with them, then they're probably outstaying their welcome, or the players are spending too much time building them up and not doing anything with them.
I'm going to say we've had traits cross episodes. And what I mean is we may be doing a story arc and they're collecting clues. And so we'll have that trait float across episodes so they kind of remember, oh yeah, we're pursuing this and we've discovered this and we're carrying this clue with us to resolution. Or if there's some sort of philosophical issue that is constantly at contention, and maybe diplomatically, that trait will float through multiple episodes or come back when that character comes back. That trait comes back into the scene. So you can use them really quickly, and you can also stretch them out.
I think if they're going to last like that, then you probably want to have them set aside and treated, handled a little bit more, handled in a special way rather than in amongst the mass of the ones that are building up during a more tense, rapid fire scene.
Yeah, one of the things that I do, Jim, is I'll take the index cards and just fold them up into tents when I have like scene traits or environmental traits, things like that everybody needs to be aware of. And what I do is I have my players keep their character sheets in, those plastic binder sleeves, and they each have dry erase markers. So if they have a trait that they have created, I have them write it down in dry erase on their actual, sheet protector. And then, as Nathan said, as it's no longer applicable, I just have them wipe it off. And that seems to really keep them engaged, especially if they know it's like their plan that they created or whatnot, and they have that note there. So that's the way I do it when I'm in person.
Oh, I love it. It's almost like I love the idea of using the dry erase index cards or markers or whatever, almost to the point where, like, I don't want a lot of electronics at my table, but like every player could have their own little pad, right, with their character sheet on it, and they could be jotting down the traits as they go, and or even the game master could push traits to their pads back and forth. That's probably going down into the weeds on technology, but that's great stuff. So Michael, you brought up a great topic, and I wanted to pick Nathan's brain a little bit about this, because this is one of the things I've thought about traits is like when you're in a scene, it's a pretty small expenditure of momentum or threat to change a trait or create a trait or whatever, right? So what's your guidance on a character who creates a really interesting, persistent trait that would make sense for that character to carry on into multiple episodes, right? It seems like 2 momentum to create a really important trait is a heck of a bargain to add to that character that you could then have for 2, 3, 4 episodes or sessions, or even just become a permanent component of your character. Just any thoughts on that potential really useful tool for a really low cost?
I think that it does require leaning heavily on the fact that a trait only persists as long as it is both true and important and irrelevant. So it may well be that the player has created this trait, but that doesn't mean it's going to be important after the end of the current scene. If they want to keep it around, and if it feels like it's going to continue to have relevance, yeah, I'll let it carry on. But it's the longer it exists, the more it needs to justify its existence.
We just had a character create Troublemaker a couple episodes back as a trait, because they were so pissed off at the philosophical debate that was going on, and it almost brought a rebellious side on them. And I am pushing them to play it. I'm like, okay, then you got to really be ready to screw up some scenes.
I would say if the player wants to add that as a permanent element to their character, it's a character trait. It's something that's added to the actual character sheet as a permanent thing. Do that as a part of their just end of session kind of character upkeep when they're doing arcs and milestones. Yeah, there's a few little tweaks that you can make to a character in those situations. If they want to keep a trait permanently as an ongoing part of their character, add it there. Maybe even work it into one of their values when they next should they change that value later. If it's something like a piece of equipment they've created, then I don't expect that to last. It'll last as long as it's useful, and it'll fade away again. And if they want to bring it back, they can bring it back later. I think most traits are only going to last that long. It's a rare trait that will be permanently embedded on a character, and it's probably going to be a character trait. And even then, a lot of character traits won't. The second edition encourages more use of traits to represent characters being put in particular mental states and moods, and even things like that. Things like in the 2009 movie, Spock being emotionally compromised by the destruction of Vulcan and the death of his mother. That's arguably a trait. It's also a trait that, as a Vulcan, he could suppress and push aside because he's got his mental discipline specialist ability. But eventually, Kirk pushes into a point where he can't ignore it anymore. And it's a trait. It's going to affect the way that he behaves. It's going to affect the options that are available to him and the options that he considers. Or for a Strange New Worlds example, end of season 1, Spock letting out his anger to help him deal with the Gorn hatchlings. And that had repercussions, probably because he's going against his own values by letting his anger out like that. But it's also a lingering character trait that he's put on his that he's put on his sheet, and it's going to affect him while it remains true.
Yeah, and as a game master, your job is to know those traits that your characters have and are working with, and to like push them at those moments like Kirk did. You know what I mean? Like, you know your characters, and if you know that there's a trait that's lingering, create a little B plot where that trait, gets messed with a little bit or something like that. Especially, with a character trait, or if you've created a piece of equipment and that person just wants to keep rolling with it, give them a complication with it and give them a scene to deal with that. As a GM, just be aware of what traits everyone is carrying with them.
So just to riff on that a little bit, two examples that I want to pick Nathan's brain about. I think I know conceptually what we're going to go with it, but just to throw these ideas out there. Original series, Uhura goes through a situation and her memory is wiped, and they have to do complete and they don't ever touch on it again. But like, she's in sick bay, she's completely lost her memory of everything, and they have to reconstruct that could be a character trait, right? Of like, you are a clean slate. Now that's going to be a temporary trait, obviously, because in role playing they would probably do some subplot sessions. They would probably do a couple of sessions of having that character go through the therapy and go through the change and eventually remove that trait because it won't be true any longer. But that could be a short-term character trait that could be created.
I like that. I just want to add, before you go, Nathan, I would add that also at the start of an episode, like when Harry Kim and Bobby Duncan McDill were in prison at the start of the episode, they were a little malnourished or tired. That could start off right at the beginning and carry into some of their, actions.
Absolutely. I would actually I would probably consider Uhura's memory loss as an injury almost. It's not only is it a trait, but it's it's an injury, and injuries obviously have specific rules for the way that they are removed. So it's going to have it's not something that's insurmountable, but it's going to last. Yeah. It's going to take some work to get rid of. A useful trick with that kind of thing, with injuries or any kind of trait that's lasting, is that you don't necessarily remove them, but you can certainly change them to represent an improved state. That broken arm or broken leg that your character has just gotten. Okay, well, you can't fix it immediately, but a bit of first aid, and now the character's arm is in a sling, or their leg has got splints on it, and now they're still hindered by that trait, by that injury, but it represents something lesser than the full injury at its worst, because they've had some treatment done to it, some care that's been applied that lets them do a little bit more than they could if the injury was still fresh.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Got it. Nice. And then the other example is kind of tied to what Al was saying a moment ago about, like, if a player puts a trait on their character sheet, take advantage of that and fold that into a scene if it's appropriate to do so. One example I was thinking it would be, Picard's artificial heart, right? That could be a trait that he has. He has an artificial heart. That's a fact about his character that is different than, it's not a talent. It's not a focus or anything, but it is a singular fact about him that is not going to change. But that is something that you could use in a scene. Maybe there's some significant, energy surge or energy storm or something that might impact that heart, and all of a sudden that character is in a new situation because of that.
Exactly. That's a really good approach, and one that I thoroughly recommend. And I would even take that a little bit further and say that there are a few traits that you'll probably see as that kind of like the core traits of a character that won't see a lot of play in a lot of situations. A character species trait isn't likely to come up in actual play and affect difficulty outside of fairly niche situations. Yes, a Vulcan is 3 times as strong as a comparable human, but how often does the average Vulcan actually make use of that strength? It comes up occasionally, but that's more likely to be like a narrative permission thing that lets them pull open the inactive doors that the human engineer couldn't open, or things like that. It's often situations where it's the character out of control that actually uses that. But at the same time, there are kind of these odd little occasions where those differences do come up. I would say you look to season 3 of Enterprise, and you've got the need to find Trellium in order to line the Enterprise's hull so that it can resist the spatial distortions. But surprise, surprise, it turns out that Trellium is also a deadly neurotoxin specifically to Vulcans. It's not a relevant thing in 99% of games, but now the GM has gone along and gone, okay, but because you're a different species, something affects you differently. Or you see it again in Enterprise in the fourth season episode where they bring in the Orions. Humans are all affected in one particular way. Phlox gets sleepy because their pheromones kick off his hibernation cycle. T'Pol just ends up getting a headache. Sorry, I've got a fly in my room. T'Pol ends up just getting a headache. These are there's a standard effect that you might expect everybody to get, and then, well, you've got a different species trait from everybody else. Let's do this. You've got an odd trait that represents some particular quirk of your nature. Let's do something like this. Cisco is the emissary of the prophets, so here's how this situation plays differently for him, and that's where a lot of those character traits come in really handy.
I like that, because just like a game master, when you're building a game, you really should be looking at people's values, their focus. You should also look at those kind of traits and say, hey, I'm going to make this person a star because that trait allows them to save the day, or they become the problem focus of the episode. So I think that's something that game masters should really be looking at when they're designing their games for their players.
So last question, because I'm sure we want to start moving toward wrapping up here, but just as a player or as a game master thinking about adding more traits to the game, like how far do you, like, as the game designer, Nathan, like how far do you want players and game masters to go with adding traits? Like, would you add like, my character's a parent, my character has PTSD, my character, like how like you could add dozens of traits. Like, I mean, people are people, right? We have hundreds of traits that are unique to us, that are special and important. They may not ever come up on a day-to-day basis, or they may not ever be relevant to a given episode. But like, I could imagine a number of episodes of DS9 where Cisco being a parent was actually kind of a factor in certain scenes and stuff. So like, how far down into the weeds would you encourage players and game masters to go with adding traits to their character?
I'd say that I lean into them only so far as the stuff that you could conceive of coming up during the course of play. The key is it's not just true, but it's also important and relevant. So there should only be a few traits that are on the character sheet on a permanent basis, just to give a basic sense of who the character is day to day. There's certainly more potential for a character to dig down and go, okay, but because I am this in this particular situation, this is relevant. I would say that something like a character having PTSD should probably go on the character sheet, because it's going to affect them day to day going forward. Cisco being a parent, it probably does inform a lot of his choices and actions, but I would more likely say that's probably going to be in his values rather than his traits, because it affects his beliefs and his attitudes and the way that it's more about who he is rather than what he is. You look on DS9 and you argue, yes, Cisco is a parent, so is Worf. That's not consistent. That doesn't have a consistent meaning between those two. Worf is notoriously a terrible dad.
That's great. I love the distinction. Thank you for doing that. I really appreciate that. Good stuff.
So as we're moving to wrap up, I just wanted to mention one thing, going back to the potent traits concept that we were discussing earlier. As a game master, remember that it has to narratively make sense to increase potency or to decrease potency, right? There might be a limit where things can't become any more potent. Right? If you're trying to barricade the door, there's only so many things that you can do to that door that will make it more difficult to open. Right? So if the players just keep wanting to add on to potency, don't be afraid to say, well, there's not much more you can do to barricade that door. So just something to think about from a game master perspective.
Good point. Yeah. So it's that narrative explanation we're looking with. I'm encouraging my players to become storytellers with me and to write a show that people would watch and not wag their head at. Right.
Yeah. The traits are very story first. They are literally a case of taking bits of the story and going, this is important enough to have rules attached.
Exactly. Yep. Good. Awesome. So hopefully new GMs and players, you're empowered now to see how to use traits. I mean, they're so fun. Again, my favorite mechanic in the game. And helping us all become better storytellers. So let's go into gratitude here. My gratitude is going to someone who posted on continuing missions recently. Artemis Killian created the Star Trek Adventures 2E sheet that is fillable. So, of course, Modiphius has the PDF go out, but then we have these fans who are so quick to put stuff together to make the game more enjoyable. So head over to continuing missions and pick that up for 2E if you need a fillable sheet and get to work with your crew. So thank you, Artemis Killian, for that. Of course, continuing missions always eager to take more fan-made content and get it out there and immortalize it on the site. All right, let's go Al and then Nathan.
All right. Well, we're moving into convention season, and I'm seeing more and more people talking about running Star Trek Second Edition at conventions, some are local, some of the bigger ones. So I want to thank anyone who's considering doing that for your time, your prep work, your excitement, and just trying to grow the game one player at a time. So as we move into this season, I appreciate every single one of you.
I would extend my gratitude to the community in general, the response we've gotten to Second Edition. Even if some of the choices that we've made are somewhat controversial and causing some debate, the fact that there is discussion means that people really do care. And we've tried to make the best game that we can to suit as many tastes as possible. It's not possible to make it so that it suits everybody, because everybody has different tastes and takes different things from the game. Everyone thinks different parts of the game are the bugs and different parts of the features. But it's always good to see the healthy debate that's come from this announcement. It's come from the blogs and the various discussions about Second Edition since the announcement and the quick start.
Yeah, I'll thank all the fans again for everything that they're doing for the game, to support the game, to grow the game, to help other players get into it, to help teach other game masters. I'll just tag on to Al's note about convention season. If you are in the DC metro area or within 3 hours drive, let me know, because I'm trying to find more conventions to go to, more local conventions, more regional conventions, so that I can run the quick start and get more people involved in the game. I'm still doing my research on Google to figure out like what conventions are around me, right? Like, because I just haven't had an opportunity to do a lot of them recently. So if you are watching this and you are in that kind of eastern seaboard kind of range of the DC metro area, let me know. I will try to find a way to get to your convention and get to a table, or even get to your store and run some demos for you, because I would love to meet you and love to play it. So thanks to all the fans for doing that. It's super exciting. So yeah, I think that's my gratitude for this time.
All right, fantastic. So until next time, keep playing the games, keep sending us your stories, and let's keep the conversation continuing.
Yeah, keep talking about it.
DIC.
Live long and prosper. Be safe, be well. We'll talk to you soon.